Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Mike Collins, and we're going to be talking about scaling your ColdFusion applications. And we'll look at some of the JVM things you can do there and some of the key performance metrics and session management strategies you might use. And we'll look at both using local servers and using clever things like Docker to do it more remotely. So we'll also briefly look at load testing, security, and monitoring if you're scaling your application. So welcome, Mike.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for putting this on.
And in case you don't know Mike, he's been with ColdFusion since it was born back in the Alert days. He used to work at Alert, and he's been at Macromedia and Adobe, and now he's got his own business called Support Objective that provides annual ColdFusion support and consulting. So he's a really smart guy. I'm so happy we've got him here on the show today. So, yeah. So tell us, why is scaling important in the ColdFusion world? Because maybe people haven't really thought about this topic.
Right, exactly. So the session tries to address starts off with addressing some of the big picture items as far as what you're really, almost from the install, making those first decisions from OS to the connector setup to what features you want to actually install with ColdFusion, and then walks that out into knowing your key performance metrics, and then all the way through understanding session strategies. So a lot of questions you get hit with immediately as soon as you start looking at installing and how you want to implement ColdFusion. That's what we try to do in this session.
Yeah, so you're going to be speaking at CF Summit East on this topic in Washington, D.C. in a few months. But maybe we should just back up a minute, before we go into the details of that, just to take a devil's advocate position here. Why can't you just stick more memory and more CPU and have one server?
Absolutely. So the idea here is you want to remove the single point of failure, and that's the key aspect of the discussion. We're going to be looking at how we can set up an environment where we know if one server goes down, whether unbeknownst to you or you just trying to do maintenance, you have a plan in place that you'll be able to take a server out and know your sessions are going to continue to perform. Not everybody needs seamless sessions, but the folks that do, that get the high load traffic, that the e-commerce sites that need to have that failover, these are topics that are going to be important for them.
Yeah, because if you're running that kind of site, if the site goes down, it's costing you money. So that's a reason, and it's costing your reputation as well online.
Right.
If your site's not.
And I deal with customers that have that high sensitivity, and it's if something does go down, it takes they spend hours on figuring out exactly what that was and why it was down, and it's not a small little restart the server event.
And you mentioned maintenance. So, if you have a cluster of several servers, you can take one down completely, do some patches, upgrade the hardware, whatever, and it's not going to affect your website that you're running on that cluster. That's
correct. So so right out of the gate, you're going to have a plan for how you're going to manage your sessions, and then it even goes into your code, because if you choose cache for your sessions, that'll change how you store your session variables, as opposed to if you use some of the new features in 2016, such as Redis, where you can actually use the session.scope. So from right out of the gate, these are important decisions, and a lot of times if you have legacy code that already has all the session dot scoping, it's going to make it a little bit more challenge to move to an cache. Not impossible. It may take a few days of code changes, but you can do it.
Right, and the issue there is that you've got variables that are valid for the whole user session, and they're coming back multiple times, and they might be going back to a different server in the cluster. Correct. And if you don't deal with it correctly, they're just not going to see those variables.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's one thing. I mean, sometimes sessions aren't always the most critical things for folks. They can have their users relog in, on the occasional outage. Sometimes that's probably a 50-50 type arrangement. So that's not always critical, but other things such as just knowing your key performance metrics, how much you can push a particular VM before it's better just to create another VM to handle more load and getting metrics like that.
So when people are, scaling, what are common issues you see?
I think common problems, right out of just how much JVM memory should be allocated. I think a lot of times people are unsure as far as what that number should be. Whether sometimes they may give too much memory as opposed to just finding that right number. Whether it's a gig, 2 gigs. So some of the garbage collection settings are also questions that people have that we can address. We'll talk about that in the session as well. There's new things with garbage collection that you can use, or you could just use the default ColdFusion settings as well, which 90% of folks use. So we'll address that in the session.
Right, and for people who haven't really dug into the JVM, the whole Java virtual machine running there, and it kind of builds up the amount of memory it's using, and then every now and again it does what's called garbage collection and cleans up the unused memory, and that's what you're talking about there.
Yeah. Well, those are some. As far as early obstacles, connector, how to set up your connector, and some best practices with that. There's something of an admin manager within the connector, very few people know about, that can be used, let's say, for development or even production if you wanted to. That gives you some key metrics that we'll demo in the session in April.
I imagine most people haven't even heard of that, so that'll be really cool if they can see that in your session.
Yep. Yeah. I'll actually do a live demo with some load testing, and we'll see the sessions go from one server to the other, and we'll be able to see that traffic inside that Tomcat Connector admin console page.
Any other common things you see when you're helping people out with scaling their servers?
Yeah, I would say having a plan for when things go wrong. So knowing where to look. I talk about putting in some alerts that will generate snapshots, which is usually where I go when I find a problem. I will definitely, I will want to have a snapshot at the exact moment of the issue. And 9 times out of 10, if I have that, I can solve the problem pretty quickly, because it'll tell me whether it's a database issue or it's a code issue, and right down to the line number that probably is creating the issue.
And when you say alerts, you're talking about the ColdFusion server monitor built into ColdFusion, right, or Fusion Reactor, or something else? Or?
All of the above, right? Because you could certainly do all of the above. But I think the unresponsive alert is one everybody has, and probably everybody should be using. If enterprise, that is easy to implement, and you could tune that to how many unresponsive requests. In a troubleshooting mode, you'd probably set that to 1 at 30 seconds, and then generate the stack trace. And so we'll get into some more details during the session. But yeah, so certainly that's an area, and having a plan for when things go wrong, and knowing what you're going to be doing, what you're going to want to be looking at. I think a lot of times today people they just they don't even know that where the log files are a lot of times, so you end up looking at the log files to stack traces, and then resolving the issue that way.
Yeah, well, the log files can be pretty cryptic too. So
correct. Yeah. Yeah, and there's more than one. So you have to there's the exception, there's the error, there's the application server. So there's several ones you have to know which specific one to look for. Oh, and you mentioned Fusion Reactor too. So yeah, exactly. If any monitoring tool is going to help you get visibility, going to help you. Fusion Reactor also can give you a stack trace at any time, any moment in time. So that's and it also keeps rolling logs of every request as well as the resources at the time of any request, and also what JDBC calls were done, how many records they pulled back from the database. So several ways of getting more visibility into your servers.
Yeah, I think Fusion React has a lot of good things. In fact, I did a podcast episode with David Tattersall from Integral, who made Fusion Reactor, and I'll link that into the show notes for people who are interested in that, because they just came out with a cloud version that can like store enormous amounts of data because it doesn't have to go on the server. So lots of cool stuff.
I have several customers that love Fusion Reactor, so I definitely would recommend it, and for any customer.
Yeah. So you mentioned deploying your applications across multiple servers. So is that the only way to go, or can you use Jvm instances or containers? What are the different options you have?
Well, absolutely. I think we're starting to see containers creep in to the solution. I mean, where I think today 90-some% of the solutions out there are mainly VM based. So I think several of my customers are looking at containers. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but in the end, it doesn't really. I mean, you still only have to keep track of your key metrics, knowing you're going to use, basically you're going to be using some orchestration. So you're still going to have to tell the orchestrator how many nodes you want inside your Docker orchestration, so. We'll talk about that a little bit, but we won't get in too much detail.
So what about multiple JVM instances? Does that mean multiple instances of ColdFusion, or is that something different?
Right. So I think you can do it a few ways. You could scale by having multiple JVMs on one VM node, or you can use multiple instances across many VMs. What we typically see is one instance per VM is what is for the most part. But I've seen both. I've seen where you have two, three, four instances on one VM, and then you have 4 VMs as you handle all the loads. So you end up with 16 instances that all communicate together, or some crisscross of communication.
Now, between these different options, is the licensing basically the same? Every instance you need to pay for, or some of them don't have that issue?
You would have to abide by the ColdFusion EULA, user license agreement, and I would. If you have any licensing questions, I can take those offline. It gets a little convoluted with VMs and things. There's several different ways you can license VMs, and then scale matters too, as far as as far as customers, discounting and all that. So I would definitely recommend contacting Adobe for licensing in that regard. But yes, it does matter. I mean, in how you in scale, you need to consider licensing.
Right. But particularly as if we'll talk about later, you're using containers and you have dynamic scaling going on. So,
correct, right. And I still think they're working on that. I think Adobe is still working on some new verbiage with 2018 with containers.
Yeah. So if you do this where you've got your application deployed across multiple instances or servers or containers, what happens when one of them goes down? Does that screw up what's happening on your site, or?
Well, exactly. So that's where your planning comes in. That's what the session tries to address. Is tries to bring you to those decision points and have a plan for knowing if a server goes down, what exactly is going to happen. So if you build in a session reliable architecture, your session should just be able to move from one node to the other, whether it's a VM or a container, and the end user would have no knowledge that they're now being served by other requests. And that changes too if you're more of a traditional ColdFusion app versus a web API, versus if you're just using REST APIs, you might be, there's going to be some different architectures there. So you may, the REST API version may already have an architecture that's much more flexible than, I'll say, one of your more traditional legacy ColdFusion applications.
Right. So if you have the session switch between servers, that might be because the ColdFusion instance has gone down, but it might also just be that particular instance got real busy handling a lot of threads. Is that the case, that it's doing some balancing of the load between the
there could be
instances?
If you had, right, so if the load balancer was weighted in some respects, that it determined that this whatever that threshold was triggered, then it could just decide to start sending requests to the other servers. Now, if you had sticky sessions, that wouldn't occur. That would basically always send to the same server. But in the case where you don't have sticky sessions, where you're doing round robining, then yes, the load balancer would send to whatever the next server is.
Yeah, or maybe, I think there are other strategies where even the load balancer knows how busy a server is, and it doesn't send it to the next one. It's smart and can send it to the one that's got the least.
Exactly. So, depending whatever your load, if you have like an F5 or big IP, they typically will just use a network ping. You can also do a HTTP probe, which could then call a ColdFusion page and get a little deeper intelligence as far as how the server's health is. So there's several options there, but that's getting into the specifics of what your load balancer actually is.
Yeah.
And speaking of load balancing, you have Tomcat, which is built into the ColdFusion, and then you also have just your hardware based, which is your F5, your big IP.
Which do you prefer? Do you prefer load balancing with software or hardware?
Probably, I would say probably hardware. You're still going to get a little bit more feature set from your F5 big IP, and that's typically what you're going to see out there. Not too many people use Tomcat with Tomcat you still have to get all the way to the connector before it decides where you're going, so you might get bounced. So having an F5 there, you're going to make that decision earlier in the pipeline.
So what are some of the key metrics you'd be looking at on the server to see if it was healthy?
Right. So key metrics, this goes back to when I did load balancing and how we would actually determine kind of an appropriate number of servers and things like that. So what we would do is we would, and I talk about this in the session, is basically one way to come up with some numbers as far as knowing how many servers you exactly need to meet your expected load is to actually apply load to a unit of work type of, or just a common unit of work type of server, a typical VM, let's say, apply load to that, and then watch the CPU and memory and see how much load you can actually apply to that particular VM. And then eventually you're going to get some level of comfort, some threshold where you're going to say the server basically is comfortable at 50 requests per second. This is what we can do, and that'll change if you do PDF generation or some kind of image manipulation. That may only be 10 requests per second. So you'll get some number of that regard, and then you do the math, and then you could basically determine, in order to properly handle your user base, you would need 10 VMs. You would get to that level of determination.
So that kind of calculation tells you how many servers or virtual machines you need to buy. Mm-hmm. But also it helps you plan ahead. So if you know that you're going to get a spike in traffic around Black Friday, for example, if you're an e-commerce store, you could plan ahead for that if you knew roughly how much traffic you were going to get.
Correct. Yep. So that exactly. So you could do it exactly. So you could create that math, but there's also elastic ways of using containers and orchestrations as well that you could look at it to handle those high spikes like that as well.
Yeah, so tell us about containers, because that's one of the hot new things people are doing in ColdFusion in the last few years. What exactly is a container?
Container, it allows you to use, instead of where a VM is an entire OS, a container is basically nothing. It's basically a layer that allows you to not have to create an entire VM in order to create a new slice of CPU and memory. It's a much more thinner way of managing a VM-like environment, and it's much more scalable. It allows you to condense a lot more servers on the same hardware, thus saving a lot of money. And then it's much more economical in the long run, and that's probably why it's going to basically win over the long term. It'll take years to really get into the enterprise, but it'll probably win over the long term because it does give you the consolidation over VMs. Although you can certainly run VMs in containers too, but you'll probably see it eventually replace VMware ESX over the long term.
Right. So it's basically a lightweight virtual machine, takes up less resources, and one of the other advantages is it spins up a lot faster than a VM traditionally does. So
correct. Yep. It gives you a sandbox that just sandboxes your process with the CPU and memory at a very thin layer.
And then the other thing is you can have that container on your own local laptop that you're developing on, get it all working, save all the configuration in a script language so it's all programmable as far as the configuration, and then just upload that to wherever you're hosting it out in the cloud.
Correct. Yep. So yeah, it's exactly. We have a number of customers. We're seeing a lot of customers go that route. It's still a lot of traditional just VM ColdFusion out there as well. I know in the CF Summit, I did a survey of the group, and I don't think anybody had Docker or any orchestration in production yet. I think everybody's looking at it. Everybody's kind of developing with it, but it's still not in production yet on some of the more larger ColdFusion customers.
And you mentioned orchestration. What exactly is that in reference to containers?
It basically, you could think of it as just a set of instructions you're going to tell a product like Kubernetes or Rancher. You're going to tell it a set of instructions as far as how to elastically grow and shrink, and how many nodes you're going to actually need for your entire environment. So it's tries to simplify basically scaling your different containers.
So instead of you having to manually spin up another instance of ColdFusion running in a container, it monitors all the dozens or however many containers you have, and it decides, okay, we're not so busy now, we can shut down some of these, or it's getting busy, let's spin up some fresh copies.
Right. Yep. And then you look at each container. The metaphor people use is that each container is like a cattle. So it will regenerate. It'll kill and regenerate containers as part of its whole management cycle.
Oh, so that means you don't ever have to recycle the ColdFusion server yourself ever again. If it monitors it, and it'll kill a sick server.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, it's.
Does it take a snapshot so you can know why it was getting sick, or before it kills it? Or
that's some of the I think that's some of the weak points of some of the visibility. Is probably something that probably one of the weaker points of containers. So that's, but I'm not sure as far as if it takes a snapshot at all. I think, but it's definitely one of the weaker points of containers is just getting the visibility into a particular container inside of, what you might, if you have, hundreds of them, and then trying to figure out which one is causing the problem. That's kind of, it's more of a case where, troubleshooting is something that I think is one of the areas that needs to be looked at.
Right, because I think ideally I'd like it to not just kill a badly performing container. I'd like it to like cryogenically freeze it so I can examine the body later and try and figure out what was going on.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll happen in the future.
Yeah.
So you mentioned REST-based or API-based applications earlier. How does that fit in with all this? Does that make it harder to cluster or easier? Or
it's definitely, I would say it definitely makes it easier. I think if since it's a newer architecture, you're going to be able to, for the most part, you're going to answer a lot of the questions around session. A lot of them already have some, you're going to have some authentication layer with REST. You'll have, along with that, you'll have some session management layer that will basically resolve how you're going to manage your sessions. So that, by definition, it almost helps you turn on and off different servers and have little impact on your overall architecture.
And how does that relate to people coding using microservices?
As far as what?
Well, some people split up their app into lots of little services, and they kind of, the whole app becomes a kind of a REST thing. So different areas of the app are served by different applets. Okay.
Yeah, as far as scaling wise, I mean, I don't think, I think the layers will be there regardless. I don't see how, the architecture should kind of address, all REST APIs, whether it be smaller in nature or more larger enterprise level.
Now, earlier you briefly mentioned load testing. Do you have a favorite application you use for that? Or
I've used several in the past, but recently I've just been using JMeter. That seems to be all I really need to provide to enough stress. I'm not looking to do anything fancy. I'm just I might just do like a kind of a workload, a typical workload level of request, just to, and if there's something I know, like a PDF generation going on, I'll definitely include that on my script just to get a good generic workload of the particular server, or the requests are going to be happening on the server. And that it's not hard to stress a server. I mean, all you have to do is add users, and great, 4 or 5 different requests, and throw 100 users at it, and you'll see the load increase, and you'll quickly see where you're stressing.
So JMeter simulates users. They can log in to part of the site. They can simulate clicking on things or filling out search text, and it can kind of spread that out as though a human was thinking between the page requests and all that kind of clever stuff.
Exactly. So you'd write a few, you'd write a few scripts. So you'd pick a few pages out in your application, good sampling, and then you could tell JMeter, I would like to emulate 50 users, and then it will actually create 50 threads and start requesting the particular URLs that you have in your script. So, and then it has
and can you
graphing and all that stuff.
Oh, okay, cool. And then you can feed it in custom, like suppose the user ID and password had to be separate for the different users. You can feed that in.
Yeah. So if you you can. It has advanced scripting, so you can definitely walk through and have variables in your scripts, and so you could log in and get into your particular pages. You could get advanced like that, or just if you're in development, you could just code it so you get simple. All we're trying to do here is show where we're trying to stress the server to get to those metrics. So you could get advanced with the scripting, or you can kind of just understand what you're doing and just turn that off while you're trying to do load testing, so you don't have to get.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing is you're hitting a representative sample of pages. You can't just send it all to the home page. It's got to go through things typical users do.
Exactly. Yeah, and you could probably err on the side of your heavier pages, so then you could get a conservative number.
Yeah. The other thing I've seen in load testing is, you can't just hit pages that are displaying data. You've got to do some updates, because you may have some contention that happens if someone's updating the data and someone else is trying to do other things, run reports, or they're trying to update it.
Yeah, there's a whole science to load testing. But yeah, we're right now focusing on the performance numbers, CPU, memory. But yeah, there's certainly, if you're looking at load testing from a testing perspective, right, you'd want a complete sampling of all of your functionality.
And sometimes you're trying to see, okay, what number of sessions can this server configuration handle? Maybe you're also testing that failover you talked about earlier between the servers, or maybe you're just trying to find at what point does the server actually die, and what's the bottleneck that causes it to die.
That's true, right? So you can, as your server's under load, you can put it under moderate load and then take a server out of the cluster and then see how that works. You could be browsing the site at the same time, and then as an end user, and see what kind of experience you have when you basically take a few servers out of the cluster. So you can experiment with load and get an accurate view of what the end user would see.
That sounds really important for anyone who has an application that they need to be reliable or scale.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, what about security and all this stuff of load balancing and clusters? Yeah. Does that get affected in any way, or?
Typically, it's not something I focus on in this session. I mean, obviously we always assume there's some layer of security, regardless if it's a traditional CF app or if it's a API-based application. Obviously, I think you would probably see security more on the load testing side. So if you were doing actual, if you're looking more at the functional specs within load testing, you would just make sure your security API is working within some threshold of acceptable times.
Great. Well, sounds like you're going to have a really exciting session in CF Summit East, Mike. Yep. Anything else you want to tell people about your session before we move on to another question?
No, that's all. Yeah, we'll get to the end, and if we didn't cover anything, I'll mention it then.
Cool. So tell us why you're proud to use ColdFusion.
I just always had a passion for ColdFusion. It was described to me one time as kind of the Swiss Army knife of application tools, and it always seems like there's a way to do something with ColdFusion. No matter what the problem is, there's always a way to solve it, to integrate, whether even if you have to use some Java package or something, there's always a way to integrate it into ColdFusion. Lots of great resources out there, from all the experts on the internet as far as bringing in scripts and GitHub to the more to the real forages of projects and things like that are out there, and blogs and Charlie, of course. A lot of great just experts that you could share with that always seem to have an answer. So I really just and it relatively fast. I see a lot of applications, and in today's world, I mean, it's pretty hard to even create a slow ColdFusion page. I mean, you really have to work hard at it to create a performance issue, because I've seen some really poor code and it still performs fine. You'd think certain pages would take forever, but they work very fast. So it's very forgiving that way. Migrations are very forgiving. Backward compatibility. I do a lot of migrations, so very few problems going from 10 to 11 to 16. Not always perfect. There's a few things that come up, but it's very clean. You can't say that about a lot of products. So that's kind of why over time, I've kind of really learned to appreciate working with ColdFusion.
That's great. Mm-hmm. So what would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive this year?
I always like to see it adapt, see it integrate with the newer technologies. More sample apps with some of the newest and greatest stuff. I've been looking at things like Vue.js recently. So I saw that Miro was doing some things with Vue. So maybe anything that they can integrate, bring some younger talent in the ColdFusion world, and make it in the whole CFML world, then I think all the better, right? Because it's always you're always looking for that adoption story. So it's been around a while, so anything that will make it newer and fresh, I think will be great.
I was talking with Mike Brunt the other day, and he mentioned that Jeremy Allaire's got a new venture to do with blockchain, and we were kind of saying, well, how could we marry ColdFusion and the blockchain that do what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah. Anything that brings it into today's technology scope.
Yeah. So, what are you looking forward to at CF Summit East this year?
I always like seeing the team getting back. Probably we've got 2018 coming out, so that's going to be new, exciting. Learning about the new monitoring tool is probably one of the bigger things. So I'll see that updated. They showed that off at Summit last year, so I'll see what's going on with that. And just meeting all. I have some contacts up in DC, so it'd be great to see them as well.
And maybe even relive that Allaire conference back in 2000 that was in DC.
Yep, you're right. Yeah.
Cool. So if people want to find you online, Mike, what are the best ways to do that?
Probably the easiest way is to just go to my website, supportobjective.com, as it sounds, one word. And or just I'm usually at the conferences. I'm usually at CF Summit. I'm usually at all the major conferences. So look me up there, and we can sit down and chat.
Great. Well, we'll put that link and together with all the other things you mentioned in the episode on the show notes page on the TerraTech site. And thanks so much for coming on the podcast today, Mike.
Absolutely. Thank you. See you.